Hello and welcome to Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethlie.
And we are the Youngs.
We're so glad you've joined us again.
Thanks for being with us today. And Christmas is just around the corner.
I feel like we need some jingle bell music in the background.
Yes, we do. Go ahead,
here.
Show it, sing us.
Oh, no, I can't. You just need the little jingle bells.
Oh, little jingle bells.
Yeah, I can't make the jingle bell noise. I wish I could.
Careful what you wish for, because our producer may throw something in there.
Yes, he has before, which is awesome.
But we just want to remind you again, this is a great time of the year to check out mypillow.com.
Yes.
And we're not going to say a great deal about that, but at least check it out. Try our promo code, YOUNG. Find out what you might be able to purchase there. It may be a great gift for someone. And I know our daughter some months ago said something about, Dad, all this MyPillow stuff, you have never bought me a pillow from MyPillow. And I was like, okay.
Oh, you're right.
She got one.
She does enjoy other things in our house that are my pillow.
And I thought that was kind of random and funny. Apparently, she's heard us talk about it enough.
Yes.
But just take advantage of that. And remember that in doing so, you are having a part in helping to support the Keeping It Young podcast.
Yes.
And we don't always say this, but we do want you to know we're grateful for all of you that listen. And please feel free to reach out to us. You can, reach out even at our website, evangelistdaveyoung.com.
Right.
My email there is Dave at evangelistdaveyoung.com. But you can also go to keepingityoungpodcast.com. There's a microphone. If you're new to us, you may not be aware of that, but you can click on the microphone on the home page. It's the bottom right-hand corner, and leave us a voice message. It will come to us in email, and we can hear your voice. And it's it's brief. You don't, you can't ramble forever, but there is that's a quick way to send us a message. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of that.
Yes.
And look, if you do write us at any time and you don't hear back from us, there's a good chance that we have lost your email in the spam world.
Right.
And sometimes we will just glance into spam and see several there. I get on average 200 to 500 spam emails a day. And most of my spam emails are set to go into a folder and are automatically deleted.
Yes.
So sometimes that does create, and inadvertently we lose you. So we don't want to do that. We just wanted you to know, reach out, please.
Just send us a reminder or, message us on social media and say, hey, did you get my email?
Yes. And in relation to Christian weddings, you may have questions, and we are very happy to hear from you.
Yes.
And so reach out and let us know any questions or even comments. We'd love to hear that as well.
Right. Or we'd just love to hear a fun story about your Christian wedding.
Absolutely. So let's jump in and get started.
Okay. So last week we were talking about what does a Christian wedding entail? And we were talking about 3 C's. We only got to 2.
Yes. Let's
we
review.
talked about the ceremony, that in the Word of God, we do see examples of wedding ceremonies. And then we talked a little bit more at length about the covenant that the whole wedding is all about. It's about the covenant between the man and the woman, pledging their lives, their loyalty, their love, their leadership, their submission, their monogamy to one another.
Absolutely. And if you haven't looked these verses up, take time to look at Genesis 2:24 and evaluate Matthew 19:5 and Ephesians chapter 5.
Yes.
The covenant idea is most clearly laid out in Ephesians 5 as far as the details of it.
Right.
And if you were with us last week, of course, we talked about that and laid out the 5 parts of the covenant that are unique to the man and the 3 parts of the covenant that are unique to the woman.
Yes.
And so we talked about the ceremony and the covenant, and today we're going to give a third word here, and just a little heads up. We may, if you have little ones, you might want to be careful to hear a little bit because we're talking about the word consummation.
Right, and we will be very wise, and this won't be the entire episode, but you just want to be careful.
Yeah, just be real careful. Bethlie was aware of that as we were looking at our notes here. There's an author named Paul Enns, I think I'm saying that correct, and Paul Enns wrote that on the first night, this goes back into history, on the first night, in history from the Bible perspective, on the first night when the marriage was to be consummated, the father escorted his daughter to the bridal chamber.
Now, just culturally speaking, even Christian culture right now, I'm thinking to myself, awkward. Okay,
that is
go
awkward,
ahead.
isn't it? And yet it was part of the traditional Bible view.
Right.
And you
yes.
found that in Genesis 29, and there's a comparison you can do in Judges 15, verse 1. And it gets a little more awkward in Deuteronomy 22, because in those days when divorce was regulated based on accusations and different things,
Yes.
the honeymoon night, they would keep even the bed covers and the bedding
Yes.
as proof of the bride's virginity.
Yes, they would.
And that was very important. And you find that in Deuteronomy 22. So a Christian wedding does not only involve the ceremony and the covenant, it does very definitely include the consummation.
Right. So that's just
and
some
by the way,
biblical references to consummation is part of Bible wedding theology.
And that article was found in the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary from 2003.
Okay.
So here's the whole point of that. The idea of becoming one begins with the sexual union that follows the covenant and then influences every area of their life.
True.
Now here's why that gets weird, because in the culture we live in, that's more important than maybe some of our listeners would think. But everything about the culture we live in treats the sexual relationship as no big deal. On the
Yes.
one hand, they treat it as if it's everything. You
Yes.
have to, you have to, you have to. And how stupid are you if you don't? And so they treat it as everything. But then on the other hand, they treat it as nothing.
Right. It's no
nothing.
big deal.
Yeah, just casual.
Everybody does this.
Yeah. And yet what we find in the Bible is that part of the relationship is very sacred. That in a covenant relationship, that human sexuality is designed by our God to be unique to a marriage
Right,
between a man and a woman in a covenant relationship.
And it's beautiful and not something that is sinful or dirty or anything like that. It is established by God to bring beauty and unity to the marriage.
And so for you that are listening that are single, no matter what the culture says, God's expectation and the Bible expectation for you is singleness. That's a good thing. And in that regard, there is no biblical opportunity for sexual expression outside of a marriage relationship.
Right.
And it's so interesting that in our culture, as our culture has accepted sexual relations outside of marriage and all of the other influences of the pornography industry, and there's so many nuances to this that are
Yes.
unique to our society. What it has done, it has removed one of the reasons people in generations gone by prioritized marriage, and that was for the sexual relationship.
Right. Yes.
And today that is oftentimes not even on the table, even for Christian young people, because they have a wrong view about human sexuality.
Absolutely.
So what
Yes.
Bethlie and I are saying as we begin here in this particular episode is that a biblical wedding involves the consummation. That is, the idea of becoming one begins with the sexual union of a young man and a young woman in a relationship that they have never experienced before. This is God's
Right.
plan. And that begins their wedding, it begins their marriage.
Right.
And that's then, although the sexual union is the beginning, that influences every other area of their life.
It does.
Meaning that they are now becoming one.
Right. So
Right.
you become one physically after the covenant, and then you apply that in every other area. So financially, spiritually, emotionally, you are constantly working on being one.
It is God's way of signaling to us that our singleness is over.
Yes.
We are no longer single,
Right.
and we are no longer privileged to live only for ourselves.
Right.
When you say I do in a Christian wedding and the wedding is consummated in the sexual relationship, then what we find out there in God's plan is that now we are officially one physically.
Yes.
Now we are also officially one in every other way.
Yes.
So, you young men, if you're single, well, you can go do whatever you want to do. You can stay out as late as you want. You can hang out with whoever you want to. There's a freedom involved in the singleness that you will not have in a marriage, because
Right.
now you are responsible for each other.
Well, you don't live selfishly. Not that single people live selfishly all the time. I'm not saying that. I know many single people who are very kind and look out for
Sacrificial.
others. Yes, sacrificial. But when you are married, you have to live selflessly. more. You can't just, hey, I'm going to go do this and leave your spouse home alone.
And this is why the wedding is so important, because you're not only part of a ceremony that is deeply ingrained in everything we believe as Christians.
Right.
And you are also involved in this covenant that makes it so unique from the world, especially today.
Right.
And sometimes Beth and I were talking the other morning on our walk about this particular series we're doing. And one of the things that came up was the idea of how different ceremonies see things so differently. And maybe you're in a culture and you're like, well, you know what? In our culture, we don't do it that way. Well,
Right.
if you're a believer, it doesn't matter whether you're American or you're Indian or you're Asian
Or Latin American.
Yeah, it doesn't
yes.
matter when we embrace Christianity, the covenant wedding. It trumps everything cultural.
Right. So that it's not wrong for you to bring in cultural decor and cultural what your family background is. If you want to bring in some of those things into your wedding because that's what your family has done for generations, that's totally fine. Unless some of them go against the Bible.
Yes.
Then you would say, you know what, we can't do that in our wedding because we are having a Christian wedding.
And what a testimony, because it evidences to people that this is different.
Right.
And can you be judged for that? Sure. Can you be made fun of for that? Sure. Can people get upset and make accusations? I'm sure all of that is true.
Right.
But the point of a Christian wedding is that it is distinctly biblically oriented, and it is made from a covenant relationship.
Yes.
And so this is all super, super important. And remember, there are different ideas, different philosophies, and different thoughts about weddings, but a Christian wedding involves a ceremony, a covenant, and a consummation.
And eventually, yes, you will leave the ceremony, you will leave the reception so that you two can go and become one biblically. And that is important. We want to be really careful here, but we have recently noticed that there are many Christian weddings that go on that focus more on, of course, the ceremony and all the beauty of that, and it's totally fine to do what you can to beautify your wedding. But then there is a huge push for the reception to go on and on and on. And there are some good things that are said, and you're like, well, we have family, we hardly ever see them, and so they're in. But remember that the focus of your wedding is so that you two make a covenant before God and before the people that you are standing in front of, that you are going to love one another only and to become one, to become man and wife. So that there should be something in you that's like, you know what, we're going to fellowship with you all for a little while, and we're going to love being with you and wish we could spend more time with you, but we have a honeymoon to get to. But we have noticed that there are some couples that are, that seems to be in the back of their mind. I have done a study recently on purity, and I don't know if it's because impurity is so prevalent in the church. We may be doing some episodes on this at a later time, so I don't want to take away from all of that. But I do know in the research that I did that the hookup culture, the live together culture, the, you know what, we're engaged, we're going to get married anyway, so it's probably okay if we're intimate, that philosophy is prevalent in the church. And so I don't know if the whole, I certainly don't judge anyone, but I don't know if the whole philosophy of it doesn't matter if we get to our wedding night or not, we can just party all night long, and then, oh yeah, we got to catch a plane at 5 a.m. And so the consummation part of the wedding, or of the wedding day, I guess I should say, is not as important in the Christian culture, and I'm not really sure why, but it should be, because it is all part of the biblical ceremony of becoming man and wife.
Well, there is no doubt why. And every statistic about our culture, even in the church, is very clear that part of the reason the consummation is no longer important is because it's not the first time.
Or it could also be, and I want to be careful here too, but moms and dads, sometimes we have become so careful in our, well, I want to protect my kids, I want to protect my kids, I want to protect my kids, that we don't present to our young adults who are growing up, or to our children as they're growing up, how important and sacred and holy and beautiful that human sexuality is, that it's a gift from God, and it's something that should be looked forward to in marriage. And so if we have, quote unquote, protected them so much, you might have a young lady growing up in your home who thinks the wedding is the big deal and the wedding night is not a big deal. And so we just are going to have this wonderful reception, and who cares if we get to the wedding night? So it could be a little of one or the other, of maybe consummation has already taken place, sadly, because we are not seeing intimacy in a biblical way, or it could be that we're not seeing intimacy in a biblical way of, it's not a big deal, I don't need to get there.
That is a very valid point. And the idea of this night of consummation is about firsts.
Yes.
And so if you're single and you're thinking about weddings and in your own life, remember that God's plan for human sexuality is in the marriage relationship. So the consummation night, the wedding night, should be about firsts.
Yes.
It's our first time to spend the night together. It's our first time to be together.
Yes.
It's our first time to do that.
Yes.
And when we understand that turns a Christian wedding totally into something very sacred, something very beautiful, something very unique in a culture like ours.
Yes.
And so this is a huge deal. Any further ideas about that before we move beyond that?
No, I just feel like I've just been digging myself into a little awkward hole. So
no, I love it. And you're exactly right. It is awkward. It's awkward because, first of all, this is no longer the norm.
Right.
And it's also awkward because some of our Christian friends even roll their eyes about, oh my word.
Right.
And when the church begins to be more secular minded, more culturally minded than biblically minded,
yes,
then Christianity is failing.
Yes.
And so we are challenging you as our listeners to think this through, because we believe the wedding is super important as the beginning of a Christian covenant relationship.
Yes.
And so there brings up one more question here in regards to what is a biblical wedding, and that is, well, what is the role of the government? And that one comes up a lot, because we know some people who have gotten married who were, older, and their whole idea is, we're not even going to report that we're married to the government because it will affect our finances. And we have others, I know of some couples who are like, you know what, we don't even need a wedding. We will just make a vow to each other, and now we're married and we'll move on with our life.
True.
So there's a lot of nuances to this. And so I did some research on what about the government. And it is very true, biblically speaking, that the government does not determine a Christian wedding.
That's true.
That I think is undeniable. I think almost everybody, if not everybody, would agree that the government does not determine the Christian wedding. However, the Bible is full of commands and teaching about our relationship to the government.
Yes.
So, for instance, I would say in the spirit of Romans 13, Romans 13 and teaching about our relationship to authority, to the government, Romans 13 would mandate that as Christians we should follow whatever cultural practices are required by law, and this is as much as lies within us.
Right.
If it is an unbiblical practice, then we have to obey God rather than men.
True.
So there's teaching about that. But basically, Romans 13 mandates that Christians should follow whatever cultural practices are required by law for them to be recognized as a legally married couple.
Right.
And does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think that's important. So if the laws state this has to be true or this needs to be true,
right,
then I would say do everything in your power to honor the government there.
Go ahead and get your marriage license.
Yes. And I'm even going to go a step farther on that idea. And we never want to set up ourselves to where we have to lie to the government for financial gain. So that's something every person has to think through. I understand that there's all kinds of situations and times are hard. I get all of that.
Yes.
But we as believers are not anti-government.
True.
We as believers believe that the government is God ordained and that as much as we possibly can, we honor the government laws and rules of our society.
Right. And we just pray for them that we can live a quiet and peaceable life.
Absolutely.
So it will go more quietly and peaceably for you, I guess, if you get that marriage license.
Yes. And it can be even more than a marriage license. It can be reporting on taxes and all of those kind of things.
Absolutely.
So what we're talking about is rethinking Christian weddings. And the point Bethlie and I are making here is that we want you to have a genuinely and undeniably Christian weddings. We believe in those. We are for those.
Right.
So we've talked about what is a Christian wedding, and we've given several answers here. And let's just throw in a couple of ideas just to sum things up. It is a Christian wedding recognizes that marriage is sacred.
Yes.
And I think that's worth our saying. It's not secular.
No.
Marriage is not secular for the Christian. It is sacred.
It is.
And it also recognizes that a wedding is a covenant vow between a man and a woman and their God.
Yes.
And I don't know that we would have to say this. In the culture we live in, our government and our society says that, oddly enough, anybody can get married. 2 men, 2 women.
Right.
Weirdly enough, in some parts of our society, you have an occasionally really odd out there, a person marries their horse or their dog. Mm-hmm. It's just such an odd society we live in, things that you would never think of as,
Right.
nobody would do that.
Right.
But what we're talking about is Christian weddings. And so that is one that recognizes that a wedding is a covenant vow between a man and a woman and their God.
Yes.
Now, traditionally, here in the United States, let's talk about the parts of a traditional wedding.
Right.
And why, maybe a little bit about why they were there. And then coming up here in our next episode, we'll be talking about just rethinking Christian weddings, some very specific areas to consider.
Yes.
Okay. But let's today talk about these parts to a Christian wedding and to a traditional wedding.
And a
maybe.
traditional wedding. And some of these are unique to a Christian wedding.
Yeah. So it does start with a processional. And the processional involves everything from when the preacher and the groom arrive.
Yes.
And in a Christian wedding, it is almost always a preacher.
Yes.
And for whatever it's worth, I highly recommend that
Yes.
because it brings a solemnity to the wedding. But there's a reason that the preacher steps onto the platform first. He is leading the procession. It is a public portrayal that this is a Christian wedding.
Right.
So the preacher, he comes in, the groom then comes next. And there's a variety of ways to do that. At our wedding, I escorted my mother down the aisle, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And then I went to a side room, and then the preacher came out and I joined him.
Right.
Sometimes there are some traditions in which the preacher comes down the aisle, followed by the groom escorting his mother.
Yes.
And then the groomsmen come down the aisle. And then, of course, the bride comes. All that's part of the processional.
Right. And the bridesmaids.
Okay.
Yes.
Then here's another part of it.
Then there's the giving away of the bride, the presentation of the bride. And it's usually her father in some cases. It can't be the dad for whatever reason. And so she has either a close family member or a man who has meant a lot to her who will give away the bride. I have seen some where the dad has passed away, and so the mom gives away the bride.
Right. And usually gives away the bride in the idea of, dad and I.
Yes.
And so often this is a masculine part of the ceremony. And by that I mean it's a familial part. So it's from the family.
Right.
And it is usually the dad. This is their tradition. And it is a nod to the Bible.
Yes.
Because of the authority of the father.
Right.
And not that we want that to be something weird or awkward.
No.
We're not weird or awkward about that at all.
No.
But we do believe that when it comes to this sacred ceremony, this is a very important part
Well, yes.
of the covenant.
And in a Christian wedding, what a beautiful picture of the families, both families coming together and saying, we are in agreement that the Lord has brought these two together and we want to show our support for them. And so the dad is going to give the bride to the groom, whose parents hopefully are smiling from the front of the auditorium.
And you know what I would say here as well, just as an aside on that, this can be a very awkward moment. Because, Dad, listen, some of you dads are just, I don't know, fearful, terrified, bothered at the idea of giving your daughter away. But if our daughters have been trained well, Dad, listen, if your daughter has been trained to be married and she's prepared to be married, and she's in love with this young man, and he is in fact a godly young man, and he's in fact a young man of whom you approve, then don't make this an awkward time. Make it beautiful, make it special. It's okay to be emotional and sweet, but don't let your emotions overrule the fact that this is a wonderful occasion. I learned that from Bethlie's dad. I appreciated so much the fact that he was so excited that Bethlie and I were getting married, and he so approved of me and so loved me and so honored me.
Yes.
That probably was the most shocking thing about our wedding to me. I was not expecting your dad. I'd always been at weddings to where, the dad would stop and say, you ever mess with my daughter, I will kill you in the name of Jesus.
Right, yeah.
That kind of stuff. Or the dad was just falling apart. I can't believe I'm giving my little girl away. Well, first of all, she's not a little girl.
Right.
She's a grown woman. And if you have done your job of training her, this should be a celebration,
Right.
not a tearing apart.
Right. I wonder if there is some pressure in the church for a man to react that way or respond that way at a wedding. But don't let that pressure you, gentlemen. Be happy for your children getting married.
Yes, and I wanted that for my children. I wanted our son-in-law David to know that when I gave my daughter Abigail to him, it was a positive thing to me.
Yes.
And we love him. He's like our son. He is our son now.
Yes.
And so this was a good thing. So there's the processional, there's the presentation, and then usually there's the sermon.
Sometimes there's a sermon in a Christian wedding, yes.
And usually that should be brief, although we have been to some weddings where that was not so brief.
It was not at all.
And one of my favorite memories of some of those is watching the groomsman and the bridesmaid standing for a 40-minute sermon.
Yes, bless them, bless them. So all of you preachers out there, take note. This is not time to practice your Sunday sermon.
Yes. And then number 4, there's the charge to the couple. And that's often different because the sermon is addressed to the audience.
Yes.
The charge is addressed to the couple.
Yes.
And when I do a wedding, I give usually the couple the charge of 5 things that I'm going to pray for them about and that they should aspire to have in their marriage.
Right.
And I know we've mentioned that on other podcasts. So
yes. Got
to keep listening if you've missed that. And number 5 is prayer.
Yes.
And that can involve many things. Usually it is a prayer in which either the pastor just leads in prayer or sometimes the couples kneel.
Yes.
And pray together. Sometimes the parents join them.
Come up and pray over them.
So there's not a right or wrong way to do that.
Right.
That's just a tradition. And then here's a few more.
The exchanging of the vows.
We believe that should be a Christian exchanging of vows.
Right. And it doesn't make it wrong for you to write your own vows, but they should be biblically based. And if you missed last week's episode about the covenant and the vows, then go back and listen to them.
And as we finish up here, there's at least 4 other parts. There's the unity display, and some are choosing to do away with that now. But
we did not do one in our wedding. I was not a huge fan of a unity candle, and so I just felt like our vows would show our unity.
In most places, though, that's still very important. And there's
is.
3 primary ones. Hand fasting, which is comes from the, how do you say that word, Celtic?
Yes, and so they braid 3 cords.
Actually, they bind the hands together.
Oh,
That's
they bind
fasting.
the hands. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the 3 cords is the second one.
And in Ecclesiastes,
Yeah, that's from Ecclesiastes 4. And in some, there's even the washing of the feet.
Yes.
And then there's 10 parts. The 8th one is exchanging of rings. I think that's a given one. Number 9 is the pronouncement and the kiss.
Yes.
And we've actually had some friends who, if that is the first kiss of the couple, they chose to do that privately.
Yes.
There's not a right or wrong way to do that, but traditionally,
Right.
the pronouncement and the kiss is public. That signifies, we are now man and wife.
Yes.
And then there's the recessional.
Right.
So those are the 10 parts to the traditional Christian wedding. And so what is a Christian wedding? It's one that recognizes that a Christian family and a church family are also a vital part in the fulfillment of that vow. We'll say more about that in our next episode, and then we'll get to some very practical advice we would give. We're out of time. We've covered a ton of material today.
We have, and we're coming into the Christmas season, and it may be that you're planning to be engaged over the Christmas holidays, so maybe this will be great episodes for you.
And we hope it's being a help, and that if it has been, and you think it would profit someone else, like it, share it, let others know about it. We would be grateful for that.
Yes.
Well, we're out of time, so you have a great week, and remember, whatever else you do, serve the Lord with gladness.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 Media production.